It is night in Jericho. The city has been locked down for days. No one in, no one out. The king knows what is coming from the east. Everyone in the city knows. The Israelites are camped across the Jordan River, and stories about them have been traveling ahead of them for 40 years like smoke from a fire that never stops burning. Stories about a sea that parted, an army swallowed by water. 40 years in a desert that should have killed them, and somehow they are still here. Still moving. Still coming. On a rooftop in Jericho, there is a woman lying very still. Under the flax stalks she spread across the roof this afternoon, there are two men who are not from Jericho. She hid them there an hour ago. Downstairs, there are soldiers from the king, asking about those very men. She has already told them the men left at sunset, just before the city gates closed. Go quickly, she said. You can catch them if you hurry. The soldiers believed her. They left. She is lying on her roof in the dark, with two strangers hidden under the flax, listening to the sound of the search party moving away through the streets below. She has made her decision. She made it before the soldiers knocked on her door. She made it the moment the two men walked in. This is not a story about a rescue. This is not a story about a sinner who got lucky. This is not a story about what God overlooked. This is a story about what God saw. Her name is Rahab. She lives in the wall of Jericho. Joshua chapter 2, verse 15, tells us her house is built into the city wall itself. She is a woman running her own establishment in one of the most fortified cities in Canaan. In a culture where women of independent means were rare and watched closely, she has managed to build a life that is entirely her own. That life, depending on which scholar you ask and which Hebrew word you trust, is more complicated and more interesting than most Sunday school lessons suggest. We will get to that. But first, the night. Because what happened on that rooftop is the hinge point of an entire life. Two strangers. A lie told to save them. A choice made in the dark, based on nothing more than 40 years of stories about a God she had never prayed to, never been taught about, never had any reason to trust. The church has spent a long time defining Rahab by her past. The Bible defines her by her faith. Here is what most people miss. There is a moment, buried in chapter 2 of Joshua, where Rahab says something to the spies that nobody reads at women and oppos, s retreats. It is not a prayer. It is not a tearful confession. It is a negotiation. And the word she uses, in the original Hebrew, is the same word used for God and oppos, s own covenant love throughout the entire Old Testament. She spoke the language of God before she knew his name. We will get to that moment. But not yet. For now, stay on the roof. The soldiers are gone. The city is quiet. Two men are hidden under the flax. And Rahab of Jericho is lying very still in the dark, having just committed treason against the city where she was born, for a God she had only ever heard about secondhand. But here is what the text actually says. She was not afraid. She was ready. To understand what Rahab did, you need to understand where she was doing it. Jericho is not just a city. In the ancient Near East, Jericho is a symbol. It is one of the oldest continuously occupied cities on Earth. Archaeologists have found evidence of human settlement there going back more than 10,000 years. In 1400 BC, it is a fortified city-state sitting at the mouth of the Jordan Valley, the gateway into Canaan. If you are an invading army coming from the east, Jericho is the first thing you have to go through. The walls are massive. The city has water. The king has soldiers. It is designed to stop exactly what is coming. Everyone in Jericho knows the Israelites are coming. This is the detail most readings skip. When Rahab hides the spies, she is not acting in ignorance. She is acting in full knowledge of a military crisis. The city is on lockdown. The gates are shut. The king has informants watching for strangers. This is an active security operation, and Rahab is living inside the walls. Literally, her house is in the wall, in a city that is preparing for war. She is not a passive woman stumbling into a divine appointment. She is a woman operating in one of the most surveilled environments in Canaan, making a deliberate choice in the middle of a national security crisis. Now, about who she was. The Hebrew word used to describe Rahab in Joshua chapter 2 is zonah. Most English Bibles translate this as prostitute or harlot. For 2,000 years, this translation has been the lens through which Rahab has been read. The woman with a past. The sinner whom God, graciously, chose to use anyway. Here is what most people miss. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus, writing in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 5, around 93 AD, describes Rahab not with the Greek equivalent of prostitute, but with the word pandikutria, innkeeper, lodging housekeeper, a woman who ran a public establishment where travelers could sleep. Scholars debate this. Some say Josephus was softening the story for his Greek and Roman audience. Others say he had access to traditions about Rahab that we no longer have. The honest answer is, we do not know for certain. But here's why it matters. The word zona in ancient Hebrew carries a range of meaning along a spectrum from sexual immorality to simply a woman who operated outside the household economy. A woman not under a husband and apos, as protection, running her own business, receiving strangers at all hours. In a culture where respectable women did not do these things, any woman who did might be labeled zona as a social category, not just a moral one. What we know for certain is this. Rahab had a rooftop large enough to hide 2 men under flax. She had a family network in the city, people she could negotiate to protect. She had a scarlet cord, a specific, identifiable item she could hang from her window as an agreed-upon signal. She could think quickly under pressure. She could lie convincingly to soldiers who were looking for a reason to suspect her. This is not a woman living in the margins. This is a woman with resources, intelligence, and agency. The church has spent centuries focusing on what Rahab was. The Bible spends exactly 1 verse on it. And then it moves on to what she did. 3,000 years separate you from her. The pressure to be defined by your worst category rather than your best choice. That pressure has no expiration date. But here is the thing about the night the spies arrived. Before Rahab hid them. Before she lied to the soldiers. Before she negotiated the scarlet cord and the covenant. She said something to those 2 men that stopped everything. It is Joshua chapter 2, beginning at verse 9. And it is the most theologically precise speech in the entire book of Joshua. She said, I know that the Lord has given you this land. I know that the terror of you has fallen on us. Everyone in Jericho is terrified of you. She did not say, I have been told you are powerful. She said, I know. And then she explained how she knew. She had heard about the parting of the Red Sea. She had heard what the Israelites did to the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan. She had taken that information, processed it, weighed it against everything she knew about the gods of Canaan, and arrived at a conclusion. She said, and this is Joshua chapter 2, verse 11, that the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. She had no Torah. No prophet had come to her. No angel appeared at her window. She had rumors. Second-hand reports about events that happened 40 years ago and hundreds of miles away. And she reasoned her way to the God of Israel. The Hebrew word for this kind of faith is emunah. It does not mean believing something you cannot prove. It means holding firm under pressure. Acting on what you know even when you cannot see the outcome. Rahab had emunah before she had a covenant. She had it before anyone offered her one. Now we come to the part of this story that nobody reads at women and apos, as retreats. The soldiers have been lied to and sent away. The spies are on the roof. Rahab comes back up, and the conversation she has with these 2 men is one of the strangest and most quietly astonishing exchanges in the entire Old Testament. She does not beg. She does not weep. She does not say, please, I helped you, so help me back. She negotiates a covenant. Look at Joshua chapter 2, verse 12. These are her exact words. Now therefore, please swear to me by the Lord, since I have dealt kindly with you, that you also will deal kindly with my father and apos' household. Give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. Pay attention to this. The word she uses for dealt kindly, and demands be shown to her in return, is the Hebrew word chesed. If you have spent any time reading the Old Testament, you know this word. It is the word used for God and apos' covenant faithfulness to Israel. It is the word in Psalm 136, which repeats the phrase his steadfast love endures forever 26 times. It is the word that describes what God owes his people because of the covenant he made with them at Sinai. Rahab used that word to describe what she had done for the spies and what she required in return. She was not asking for charity. She was invoking the logic of covenant obligation. In the ancient Near East, if you saved someone and apos' life, they owed you their protection. That was not sentiment. That was law. Rahab knew the law. She framed her request in the most binding language available to her. She was not hoping they would be generous. She was establishing a legal and moral claim on them. And here is what undoes me about this moment. She is a Canaanite woman. She is not part of the covenant between God and Israel. She has no standing under Mosaic law. She has never been to a synagogue, never heard the Torah read, never been taught the word chesed by a rabbi. And yet she speaks it fluently. She understood, from nothing more than reports about 40 years of desert wandering, that the God of Israel was a covenant-keeping God. That if you appealed to him in the language of covenant obligation, he was bound by his own character to respond. She did not just believe in God. She understood how God operated. This is not the faith of a desperate woman grabbing at any lifeline in a crisis. This is the faith of someone who has done her homework. The spies agreed. They swore by the Lord. They gave her the sign, a scarlet cord, to be hung from her window on the day of the attack, so that every soldier would know which house to leave standing. They told her to gather her family inside. Anyone inside the house, under the scarlet cord, would live. Anyone outside would take their chances. She tied the scarlet cord in the window before they were even out of the city. She did not wait. She did not think it over. She did not hedge her bet. She tied it immediately, while the night was still dark, before the walls had fallen, before a single trumpet had sounded, before she had any evidence that any of this would work. Now let me tell you what this cost her. She was born in Jericho. This was her city. These were her walls, the walls she had lived inside of her whole life, the walls her house was literally built into. Her neighbors were Canaanite. Her king was Canaanite. The gods she had grown up with, the ones the city offered sacrifices to, they were Canaanite. To tie that cord in the window was to announce to anyone who looked that when the Israelites came, she would be on their side. In a city that had just put soldiers on the street looking for Israelite spies, that was not a small thing. She chose a God she had never prayed to. She chose a people she had never belonged to. She chose a future she could not see, over a city she had known her entire life. And she did not do it in a moment of religious ecstasy. She did not do it because an angel appeared. She did it because she looked at the evidence, and she drew a rational conclusion, and she acted on it. Before the walls came down, before she had any proof she was right, in the dark, on her rooftop, alone. 3,000 years separate you from Rahab. This feeling, standing at a choice that costs everything, with nothing to go on but what you believe to be true. This feeling has no expiration date. There in Apos, one more thing. The city did fall. Joshua chapter 6. The trumpets, the shouts, the walls that had stood for centuries, every wall came down. Every wall except one section. The section where a scarlet cord hung from a window. And this is the part that undoes me. The walls of Jericho fall in Joshua chapter 6. Every wall, every gate, every fortification of that city that had seemed immovable and eternal, gone, in a single day, by a method that would have seemed absurd to any military commander in the ancient Near East. Marching, trumpets, shouting. It should not have worked. But the wall where Rahab and Apos' house stood, that section held. Joshua chapter 6, verse 22. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute and Apos' house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. The word all is doing extraordinary work in that sentence. Not Rahab alone. Every person she brought under that roof. Every family member she gathered inside those walls when the rest of the city was not paying attention. She did not just save herself. She had been planning this for days. She had been quietly, deliberately gathering the people she loved under the scarlet cord. She moved her family before the battle started. She prepared them before the walls fell. This is the woman whose faith James describes in James chapter 2, verse 25. Proof that faith without action is dead. Not faith that sat quietly and waited. Faith that hung a cord in a window and then went to work making sure everyone she loved was positioned to survive. Rahab does not fade into obscurity. Joshua chapter 6, verse 25 says she lived among the people of Israel from that day forward. She married an Israelite man named Salmon. They had a son. His name was Boaz. If you know the book of Ruth, you know what that means. Boaz is the kinsman redeemer who marries Ruth, the Moabite woman, another foreigner, another woman whose background should have disqualified her from Israel and Apos' story. Boaz married Ruth because he was the kind of man who could see past a woman and Apos' origin. He was, after all, his mother and Apos' son. Rahab and Apos' son married Ruth. And Ruth and Boaz had a son named Obed. And Obed had a son named Jesse. And Jesse had a son named David. The line of Rahab runs straight to the throne of Israel. And it does not stop there. Open Matthew chapter 1. The genealogy of Jesus Christ. Verse 5. Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. By Rahab, the author of Matthew and Apos' Gospel, writing to a Jewish audience who knew exactly who Rahab was, did not hide her, did not soften it, did not say a woman of Jericho or a woman of Canaan. He named her Rahab, right there in the bloodline of the Son of God. And then open Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, the list that begins with Abel and moves through Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. The greatest believers in the history of the world, assembled in a single chapter. Verse 31. By faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. There are only two women named individually in that chapter, Sarah and Rahab. She is standing in that list. I want you to think about this. There are women in that chapter who remain unnamed, described collectively as women who received back their dead, women who were tortured and refused to accept release. Real women, faithful women, unnamed. Rahab is named. You know a woman, maybe you are that woman, who walks into a room and watches people revise their estimate of her downward, who knows that the first thing people find out about her is the thing she most wishes they didn't and Apos, know, who has spent years being defined by a chapter of her life she cannot go back and rewrite. Rahab did not go back and rewrite her chapter. She could not. The Bible still calls her what she was. Hebrews 11 calls her the prostitute in the same sentence. It calls her a hero of faith. Both things, at the same time, without embarrassment. Because God is not embarrassed by Rahab and Apos' past. He put her in the genealogy of his son. And remember what I told you at the beginning, the line nobody reads at women and Apos' retreats? The negotiation. The treason demand. That is exactly what God gave her. Steadfast love. The same covenant love he sang over Israel in Psalm 136. He gave it to Rahab of Jericho. Because she asked for it. Because she knew how he operated. Because she tied a scarlet cord in her window and acted on what she believed before she had any proof she was right. That is emunah. That is faith. And here is the part the enemy does not want you to know. Your worst chapter is not a barrier to your lineage. Rahab and Apos' story did not end when the walls fell. It echoed forward, through Boaz, through Ruth, through David, through a genealogy that ended in Bethlehem. Nobody asked Rahab and Apos' permission when God decided to put her in that line. He just did. Three things Rahab and Apos' story tells us. And I need you to hear all three. The first, faith is not always emotional. Rahab did not have a conversion experience on a hillside. She had information. She had observation. She had 40 years of reports about a God who did what he said he would do, and she decided, without ceremony, that this God was real. Her faith was evidential. She reasoned her way to God, and then she acted. If you have spent years thinking your faith is too cold or too small or too logical to count, Rahab and Apos' name is in Hebrews 11. So is yours if you act on what you know. The second, God does not erase your past to use you. He uses you while it is still attached. Rahab and Apos' past is mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. It is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. It is mentioned in James chapter 2. Every time her name appears in the New Testament, so does that word. And every time, it is followed immediately by what she did. The past is mentioned. It does not win. The third, 2,000 years after the walls of Jericho fell, a baby was born in Bethlehem. A young woman named Mary laid him in a manger. And if you trace that baby and Apos' bloodline backward through Matthew, through Joseph, through Jacob, through Matthan and Eliezer and Eliud and Achim, you will eventually reach a name. Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. Rahab of Jericho, the woman who hid two strangers on her roof and tied a scarlet cord in her window and bet everything she had on a God she had only ever heard about secondhand. She did not just survive the fall of her city. She helped build the lineage of the Savior of the world. What is the thing in your past that you think God cannot use? Tell me below. I read every single comment. The scarlet cord is still in the window. It was never taken down.